All right, now this setup imitates what you may typically see in a hotel room with one of those round tables and a large window right next to it. Outside the room, I pointed this area light towards the inside of the room. And in the object settings, I added an abstract to grayscale image into the texture slot right here and dialed down the spread from 1 to 0.01. And then lastly, I lowered the exposure to about minus zero -0.7. Now, if you end up wanting to change the overall exposure of the light, but you find your highlights too blown out, kind of like what I ended up getting here, then you can come into the details panel and lower the reflection contribution right here to where you see fit. All right, you can leave the lighting as it is if this is the look you're going for, since there are walls opposite the light that are helping reflect light back into the scene. But if you want to control that fill light a little bit more, I ended up adding another area light that points towards those walls on camera left. I set that light rather large and lowered the exposure considerably to just barely add some exposure on the scene than where it was before. Notice here in the comparison, you can notice just a little kick of light in the shadows when I added that light in, as opposed to when I did not. The next setup is very versatile and one of my all-time favorites. I typically start with an HDRI to create an ambient fill light, and then add a single area light with a gobo texture to create that dappled light look. And here's how I set that up. In the object settings of the HDRI, I used GSG's Modern Industrial 14 HDR in the texture slot and set the exposure to about 1. And this is what the exposure looks like at the moment. And then to camera left, I added one large area light that has a gobo texture to it with a temperature of about 4600 Kelvin. And of course, to make the gobo work in Redshift, I set the spread all the way down to 0 or close to 0, depending on how hard or soft you want those shadows. And again, you can easily adjust the lighting ratios by either dialing the exposure on the HDR or on the area light, or a combination of the two, depending on the look that you want. All right, and here's the result for setup number 2. Let's move on to setup 3. This next and final setup takes place in what looks like some kind of living room. I first started again with an HDRI to set an ambient light exposure, and for this one I used one that's called Art Studio from Polyhaven. I set the exposure to about minus 1.5, and this is what I get. Then I added an area light pointing in towards the upper left corner of the frame with a null object as its target for better control. Now I made this light quite large to cover the entirety of the frame, and then placed another GSG gobo texture in the texture slot and then set the spread to 0.01. Lastly, I set the exposure to -1, and this is what we get. Now, if you don't like where the shadows and highlights are falling, you can increase or decrease the size of the light, or you can simply adjust the position of the area light to guide where you want those shadows to fall. And once that was set, here is the image I ended up getting. All right, here are the results of the 3 lighting setups I created for this week. I hope you found this helpful. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you next time. Take care.